So on my way over this morning, I became nervous and thought, why did I let Carrie talk me into this? She's lovely and she's new, and I felt compelled to say yes. I had dodged these invitations, sorry Jan, for a long time. And then I thought, am I about to give a sermon in my workplace? Is that what I've just agreed to do? But I did remember my auntie years ago who told me that women can give testimonies or talks, but they never give sermons. So that was freeing, at least. And I will not be giving you a sermon then this morning. And then the music, which was lovely, and the idea of be as you are. And so I'm going to try to think about that and just be as I am this morning and share a little bit with you. So I grew up on a farm outside of a town of about 7,000 people in Kentucky. And this town of 7,000 people has more than 20 Baptist churches. Both of my parents, all of their extended families were raised Southern Baptist, and that is the tradition they raised their 4 children in, myself included. We went to church 3 times a week. If there are any Baptists in the room, some of this will sound familiar. We also went on Fridays every now and then as a bonus. We did Bible drills. If anybody remember the Bible drills? I'm getting some nods. Bible school. My favorite part of Bible school was the Onward Christian Soldiers song. It's very militaristic. Marching to war with the cross of Jesus going on before. I get it. Oh, I love it. Thank you. Forward into battle. See his banners go. Okay, we'll talk about that later. I also grew up in a dry county. I don't know if North Carolina has these at all, but it means that you can't buy alcohol anywhere in the county, and so you had to drive quite a distance to drink, but you had to do that alone because you weren't telling anyone else that you were going, right? A lot of Baptist wedding receptions in the basement of the church. If you haven't attended a Baptist wedding reception, you have mints and nuts and punch. There's no drinking, there's no dancing. They're rather short. When my sister married a Catholic man, she asked for the 10-minute Baptist wedding, but the long and very wet and dance-filled Catholic reception. She did not get it, but I digress. So comfort and community from a church-going upbringing was really important to me growing up as a kid. And yet there were times where I felt like I couldn't put the edges of my life together, sort of fitting some of the things that worked and some of the things that didn't. As a young child, I asked a lot of questions. And the answer that I heard a lot of times in church was, we cannot know the will of God, or it is not for us to ask or question. And that was puzzling to me. I wanted to engage, to question, to talk, and I thought that it actually might bring me closer to God. But I got the feeling in a lot of my religious upbringing that people were worried that that would drive a wedge, that questioning and asking was going to do some damage, that would drive me further from that seeking and asking to not being part of the church. I continued to find comfort in the community, the songs, the messages, the love that I felt in church. It's wonderful to have lots of people outside of your family who know who you are and what you're doing. And even coming back from college, to have church members who knew where I had gone to school and when I would be back and seemed to be following along in my life. There was great comfort in all of that. And yet I was troubled growing up in the church by messages that I heard at times by fellow church members. I recall very negative messages about interracial relationships growing up in my church. That was commonplace. I came home in 2nd grade and asked my parents about that one, and they later said they were really glad I was asking those questions. I can tell you they surely did not seem to be glad when I was asking them in the moment. And I loved the minister of my church growing up. He baptized me. He married all of my siblings. He was thoughtful and kind, and he always took time for those questions. But that was not always true of the many youth ministers that were in my church. I learned a lot of negative things about other religious traditions in my youth group, and about people who were not Christian, but also about others within the Christian tradition that the leader would read out of the faith, namely Mormons and Catholics. I remember that pretty distinctly growing up. Later, I would question some of the things I learned about, and I like to think now I was questioning them at the time, but I'm not sure that I really was. I think I probably was just thinking about all of those things, immersed in that culture in the way that you would. I later ended up marrying a Catholic who ended up writing 2 books about the LDS tradition, but that's getting ahead of myself there. In high school, I began to question even more, and I saw the great comfort that my family felt at funerals and the certainty that people were in fact in a better place. And I could muster those feelings for the grandfather who was 96 and in poor health, but when my classmate died in a car accident at 16, it was much harder for me to hear the messages of, we know that this is the will of God, and we know that someone is in a better place. I had trouble thinking about that, and those doubts really plagued me. And I kept thinking about the parts in my mind that didn't fit well with the parts in my heart, and that was always hard. I attended a conservative Southern Baptist college. I was editor of the college newspaper, and I wrote these inflammatory articles. I'm really embarrassed to look back now at what I thought was a provocative argument at the time about social justice and care for the least of these. These were rooted in my religious tradition and upbringing, but members of the board of trustees at the college didn't seem to see it that way, or as well as my fellow students didn't either. One board member demanded that someone talk to the editor and get him to stop. And so I don't know if my name sounds like a guy's name or if it was just hard to fathom that a woman would be writing any of those things, but it was quite the controversy during the college times. I read more, I questioned more and more, and my deep abiding faith waned. I met atheists who were really great people, and I met religious people who were terrible ones. I met devout and wonderful Muslims and Jewish people as an adult. I want to keep that in mind. I was an adult before I ever met anyone who wasn't a Christian. In a graduate class, when I was in graduate school, we had a presentation about a Christian group, and the presenter asked if anyone in the class was Christian. It was striking that no one raised their hand, including me. I left that class, and I went home, and I cried. I was not embarrassed to say I was a Christian, but rather I had simply decided I was not, but not consciously until then. And so I cried for that lost past. I cried because of a potential lost connection with my family. My sister was a youth minister. The church was the whole social network for my extended family. Never once in my growing up did we host a party, dinner party, guest, anyone in our home other than family or church-related events. This was a big part of who I was and who my family was. It was easy to not be religious in a university, maybe too easy, in fact. I began to enjoy lazy Sundays with the New York Times. There were lots of good things you can do in a lot of the time that you had previously spent going to church, and I enjoyed some of those. But I continued to mourn that loss, and it felt like something that was part of me just was not there. And I just needed to find the right path for me, but it was hard to do. I read John Shelby Spong's book about interpretations of the Bible. Who was this dude? I don't know if anybody knows his work at all, but I knew the Bible pretty well, and I had never read anybody talk about it in that way. And that was exciting for me. That was invigorating. I come from a long line of people who pray, and when I stopped, they kept on. And that felt comforting. I always attended church when home and when visiting family, but I just never found a place of my own to get back on that track. When I was pregnant with our first child, Tom and I made some jokes about needing to find a church so our baby's soul was not hanging in the balance. Those jokes worked for him as a Catholic who baptized at birth, but as Baptists, we go with age of consent, so it really didn't matter to me anyhow. There was some time for that. I was the ripe old age of 8, by the way, when the Spirit called me to be baptized, so I thought there was plenty of time to handle this. At that time, we were living in Indiana, and I came home with the local newspaper one day and had read the editorial of a local minister who was arguing that the Methodist Church needed to take a stand on an important social issue. We found our church, and I found my way home again. And we managed to baptize that baby as well, in case some of you were worried and concerned about that. Gospel music, good thought-provoking sermon, the community that comes from a church family. Oh, I had missed those so much. And yet it was interesting to blend this back into my life as an academic by then as well. In journalism circles, private lives were not discussed very often for a whole variety of reasons. And so I didn't know whether people were religious or not in many of the journalism communities I'd been in. In the university at our previous institution, it seemed that most people were decidedly not religious and vocal about being so. Even today, I'm still in many settings where it is assumed that I'm not religious at all, just as when I'm in Kentucky, it is assumed that everyone is Christian. I hope I can be a voice to help bridge and help people understand each other's perspectives, having spent some time in each of those perspectives. I have more than once been the person held up in a setting as someone who is religious. Often there's an apology. I know you're vegetarian. Sorry that we're serving so much meat. I know you're religious. Sorry that I think it is all super ridiculous. But most notably, 2 years ago, I ended up coming home and sharing with Tom this story. I was in New York with a group of documentary filmmakers, and I'm at the end of the table, and I hear at the other end, "Hey, Brooke believes in God, let's ask her." So the whole table then turned to me like an interactive museum exhibit, and are you really following what you've always known? Have you ever really thought about any of it? You seem really smart. Why do people do horrible things in the name of religion? The same kinds of questions, by the way, that my children proffer to me now, much the way I peppered my parents with questions as well. I deserve to be on the hot seat, having made it hot for so many others in the past. So When we came to Elon, I lined up a meeting with our then chaplain, Richard McBride, whose name you see in the room behind us. I asked him to lunch and told him the kind of church I was seeking since we had moved here. And he told me to let him know when I found it because he would come with me also. So apparently it was a tall order, what I was seeking. And it took us 3 years before we found the right church home here. We visited a lot of churches. We had the minister who kept asking Tom about his work and why we came here, despite Tom himself saying we came for Brooke's job. That disconnect didn't seem to happen. The minister who kept very kindly inviting me to the Women with Toddlers play group that met at 10 a.m. in the morning, despite the fact that I kept saying I work outside the home and I'm never going to come to the 10 a.m. toddlers play group. The church welcome crew member who came to our house after attending the church and made a joke that he assumed we would find funny, which we did not in our home. So once again, the birth of a second baby and a child's soul hanging in the balance, I think, prompted us to think and find another church as we were pregnant with our second child, and we did find a church that has been a wonderful home for us for the past 15 years, now moving into 16, until recently when we moved to a church that's walking distance from our house, which has been even better. It took for me leaving the church and coming back as an adult to better see the ways I can be a red-letter Christ follower. For those of you less Bible-versed, pun intended, sorry, the words of Jesus in the New Testament in many versions of a Bible appear in red letters. And Jesus said clear things about judging people, about our obligations to the poor, and caring for the earth and each other. Just last year in a discussion, Tom was in a conversation with colleagues and some uncharitable discussions about Sunday school teachers came up. And Tom immediately outed me as a Sunday school teacher. Okay, maybe that dispelled the stereotype in their minds, or maybe it confirmed it. I don't know. Either way, I own it. That mid-20s transformation is my foundation for social justice in the world, my reminder to walk humbly, act with grace, and try to be a force for good in the world. And thank goodness for my minister who tolerates a whole lot of questions, even if the answer's often, who really knows, but let's just think on it. Thanks for listening today.